What if the deadliest enemy humanity ever faced didn't die with a bang, but with a whisper? October 26, 1977. A man stands in a small, dusty village in Somalia, unaware that history is quietly turning its final page. His name is Ali Mayo Malin, a hospital cook, a father, a man of modest means. But soon, his name will be etched into the record books for a reason no one could have imagined. For on this day, he will become the last person on Earth to contract one of humanity's oldest and most merciless killers, smallpox. The disease had haunted the world for over 3,000 years. It outlived empires, toppled kings, scarred faces, and erased entire civilizations. Pharaohs carried its marks. Conquistadors spread it like wildfire across continents. And yet, on this day, October 26th, something extraordinary was happening. Humanity had finally hunted it down. Every chain of infection, every hidden ember of contagion, every microscopic remnant of the virus extinguished, but the path to that moment was paved with suffering, fear, and unimaginable sacrifice. Centuries before that silent day in Somalia, smallpox was a name whispered in terror. Its victims could not be mistaken. High fevers, aching limbs, and then the spot. Red, angry blisters that covered the body like a grotesque second skin. Those who survived were often left blind, or with faces so scarred they became unrecognizable. In ancient times, it was seen as divine punishment. In medieval Europe, it was called the speckled monster. In the 18th century alone, it killed more people than all the wars of that century combined. Whole villages would disappear. Children were taken before they could speak their first words. Parents died holding the hands of their fevered sons. There was no cure, no escape, only the faint hope of survival. And yet, amid the despair, a single spark of human ingenuity began to glow. It came from an English country doctor named Edward Jenner. The story goes that Jenner had noticed something peculiar. Milkmaids who had contracted cowpox, a far milder disease, never seemed to fall victim to smallpox. It was a whisper of a connection, a rumor among farmhands. But Jenner dared to test it. In 1796, he took material from a cowpox sore and inoculated it into a young boy named James Fitt. Weeks later, he exposed the boy to smallpox. The boy didn't get sick. The world changed overnight. Jenner's crude experiment gave birth to the vaccine, a word derived from vacca, Latin for cow. What began as a desperate experiment in an English village would become humanity's greatest weapon against a microscopic tyrant. But eradication! That was a dream too vast for anyone to truly believe in. Smallpox was everywhere, in the deserts of Africa, the jungles of South America, the crowded streets of India. It thrived in war zones, in famine, in poverty. It didn't respect borders or treaties. How could you possibly chase down an invisible killer that traveled in breath, in sweat, in whispers? Then came the 20th century, the age of global ambition. Science, for the first time, had the tools to fight back on a planetary scale. In 1958, a Soviet scientist named Viktor Jidanov stood before the World Health Assembly with a radical proposal, a global campaign to eradicate smallpox completely. The idea sounded insane. Even some scientists scoffed. Eradication had never been achieved for any human disease. But the world, scarred by wars and divided by ideology, found one rare because they could unite behind. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, agreed on something. They would fight a common enemy, not with bombs or spies, but with needles and vaccines. What followed was one of the most extraordinary humanitarian efforts in history. Teams of doctors, nurses, and volunteers set out across continents, from the freezing tundras of Siberia to the sweltering plains of Africa. They carried boxes of vaccine on their backs, in jeeps, on donkeys, even in canoes. Some risked their lives crossing borders, navigating war zones, bribing militias all to reach one more village, one more child. The campaign was relentless. Every new case triggered a surge of activity. Villages were quarantined, homes disinfected, and everyone within miles vaccinated in a ring around the infected. They called it the ring vaccination strategy, a wall of immunity built around every spark of infection. And it worked. Slowly, the numbers began to fall. In India, once the epicenter of smallpox outbreaks, the last case was reported in 1975. In Bangladesh, the last in 1976. The virus was being cornered, squeezed into the edges of the map. Until finally, only one country remained: Somalia. In the dusty coastal town of Merka, a young man named Ali Mayo Malin was working in a hospital. Ironically, he helped transport patients infected with smallpox, but he had never been vaccinated himself. He thought he was safe. After all, he wasn't a patient, just a driver. Then one day, while escorting 2 infected children, the virus found him. Within days, fever and chills took hold. The spots appeared. He knew what it was, and he hid. Fear of isolation, fear of stigma, fear of being the last. For a few critical days, Ali tried to conceal his illness, but it was too late. When the surveillance team finally found him, he was already covered in lesions. The world watched, holding its breath, as his case was contained. Everyone who came into contact with him was vaccinated. Every possible link was traced. And when Ali recovered, something extraordinary happened. There were no new infections. October 26th, 1977. The chain had been broken. But before anyone dared celebrate, scientists wanted proof, absolute proof, that smallpox was truly gone. For 2 long years, they searched. Laboratories tested samples. Doctors combed through hospital records. And field teams scoured remote villages from Ethiopia to Indonesia. Not a single case appeared. Then, in December 1979, a declaration was drafted. Smallpox has been eradicated from the world. 2 years later, the World Health Organization officially certified it. Humanity had achieved the impossible, the complete elimination of a disease through sheer will, cooperation, and science. And yet, not everyone could rest easy. Some whispered that samples of the virus were still kept in locked freezers in secret laboratories in the United States and Russia, preserved just in case. What if one vial leaked? What if someone used it as a weapon? After all, a virus that once killed 300 million people in the 20th century alone could be more terrifying than any bomb. To this day, smallpox exists. Frozen, silent, waiting. The decision to destroy those remaining samples has sparked debate for decades. Should humanity erase it completely? Or keep it as a safeguard against the unknown? For now, those vials remain. 2 laboratories, 2 nations, holding the last remnants of an ancient terror. Humanity's victory and its temptation. So when we celebrate October 26th as the day smallpox was eradicated forever, perhaps the better question is, was it really? Because in the quiet hum of a refrigeration unit deep inside a government vault, the virus that once brought empires to their knees may still be whispering, waiting for the day it is remembered again. And the man who became its final victim, Ali Mayo Malin, lived long enough to see the world he helped save. Decades later, he would join vaccination campaigns himself, traveling from village to fight another enemy, polio. He would tell children his story, not as a warning, but as proof that even the smallest act of courage can change the course of history. But history has a way of circling back. In 2014, smallpox vials were accidentally discovered in an old storage room at the National Institutes of Health in Maryland. Forgotten for decades, hidden behind boxers, still potent. It was a haunting reminder. The line between eradicated and forgotten is thin. So the question remains, did humanity truly destroy smallpox, or merely lock it away? And if history has taught us anything, can something so powerful ever truly stay buried forever? Because sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones we see in the light, but the ones that wait patiently in the dark, silent and unseen. And as the world celebrates its triumph on October 26th, somewhere in a vault, chilled to perfection, the ghost of smallpox sleeps, not dead, not alive, but waiting. For now, the world thought it was safe. For the first time in history, humanity had conquered a killer that once ruled unchallenged. The year was 1980. Fireworks of triumph lit up the sky. Scientists toasted to a new era, and the word eradicated echoed through the halls of the United Nations like a sacred hymn. But even as the celebrations unfolded, far from the spotlight, in laboratories sealed behind steel doors and biometric locks, the virus variola major had not vanished. It had merely been exiled. Inside one such lab, deep in the Siberian tundra, stood a building that looked ordinary from the outside. Snow dusted its concrete roof, the wind howled around its edges, and the Russian winter cloaked it in stillness. But beneath its sterile corridors and flickering fluorescent lights lay one of the last places on Earth where smallpox was allowed to exist. Frozen in glass vials, suspended in nitrogen, lay the remnants of a nightmare. Each vial was labeled, catalogued, guarded, and yet the weight of what it contained could never truly be contained. Half a world away, another laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia, carried the same burden. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention housed its own collection of the virus, preserved for research, for safety, at least that's what officials said. But there was something haunting about the idea the two opposing nations, who had spent decades staring at each other through the crosshairs of the Cold War, both held in their hands the key to humanity's destruction and its survival. What if one vial broke? What if a technician made a mistake? In 1978, even before the eradication was declared, that what if had already come true. In Birmingham, England, a medical photographer named Janet Parker began feeling unwell. Fever, headache, fatigue. At first, doctors thought it was the flu. Then came the rash, unmistakable, horrifying. Smallpox. It shouldn't have been possible. The virus had been eliminated from the wild. The source? A research laboratory just one floor below her office. Somehow, the virus had escaped invisible, airborne, unstoppable. Janet Parker died alone in isolation, the last person to die from smallpox anywhere on Earth. The incident sent shockwaves through the scientific world. Her death became a warning that even in victory, humanity was never truly safe. After Birmingham, the rules changed. Every sample of smallpox, every speck of its DNA, was ordered to be destroyed or transferred to the two remaining authorized facilities, one in Russia, one in the US. The world had spoken. These would be the only two vaults allowed to keep the monster alive. And so, the virus slept. Decades passed. Generations grew up without fear of smallpox scars. But as the world forgot, whispers returned. Scientists began to question. Should we finally destroy those last samples? Or would that be reckless, erasing the one chance to understand it if it ever returned? Some argued that smallpox might still exist in nature, hidden in frozen corpses buried in the Arctic permafrost, waiting for the ice to melt. Others believe it might exist in secret stockpiles, held by nations unwilling to surrender their ultimate weapon. The debate became a moral riddle. Would destroying it mean freedom or vulnerability? In 2014, the past made its move again. Workers cleaning an old storage room at the National Institutes of Health near Washington, D.C. stumbled upon a cardboard box. Dusty, forgotten, tucked behind old bottles and lab equipment. Inside was 6 small vials labeled Verilaw. For decades, they had lain hidden, their existence unknown to anyone alive. When tested, the virus inside was still viable. Still deadly. The discovery shocked the world. It was a reminder that smallpox wasn't just a ghost, it was a prisoner, capable of breaking its chains at any moment. The public began to ask uneasy questions. If these vials were forgotten for 40 years, how many others might still exist? In abandoned hospitals, old university basements, or forgotten freezers in former Soviet labs? Could the virus, once thought extinct, already be waiting somewhere, patient as ever? And then came a new kind of threat, one not of nature, but of human design. With the rise of biotechnology, gene editing, and synthetic DNA, scientists realized something terrifying. It might now be possible to recreate the smallpox virus from scratch. In 2017, Canadian researchers proved that a cousin of smallpox, the horsepox virus, could be synthesized in a lab for just $100,000 using mail-order DNA. If horsepox could be brought back, could smallpox be next? Suddenly, the victory humanity celebrated on October 26, 1977, didn't feel as final. The monster had changed its form from a living virus to a digital sequence, stored in computers, readable by anyone with the right tools. The line between eradication and resurrection had never been thinner. And yet, even as scientists wrestled with these dangers, another fear began to rise. The possibility that nature itself could turn on us again. In Siberia, melting permafrost began revealing frozen animal carcasses from centuries past. Reindeer corpses infected with anthrax thawed and released spores that infected entire herds and even people. If anthrax could survive the ice, what about smallpox? Some scientists believe that victims of smallpox buried in Arctic graves, their bodies perfectly preserved in the cold, might still harbor infectious traces. In 2016, a group of researchers in Russia unearthed such a grave on the banks of the Kolyma River. They found human remains, skin lesions intact. The samples tested positive for fragments of smallpox DNA, though the virus was inactive. The discovery sent a chill through the scientific world. The ice was melting. The past was waking up. The story of smallpox, it seemed, refused to end. But maybe that's because it was never just about a disease. It was about humanity's relationship with fear, with control, with the unknown. Smallpox taught us how fragile our dominance truly is, that even a creature invisible to the naked eye could humble the greatest empires. It forced humanity to unite in ways war never could. It showed that cooperation could conquer chaos, and yet victory came with arrogance. We began to believe eradication was easy. Repeatable? We turned our gaze to other killers. Polio, malaria, measles, confident that science would triumph again. But each battle revealed the same truth. Eradication is not a moment. It's a promise, one that must be defended every single day. As years turned to decades, the man who had once been smallpox's final victim, Ali Mahu Malin, carried that promise with quiet dignity. He traveled across Somalia, working with vaccination teams, his story a living testament to humanity's resilience. "I was lucky," he once said. "Now I must help others be lucky too." But fate has a cruel symmetry. In 2013, while working to eradicate another disease, Polio Ali contracted it himself. He died that same year. The last victim of one eradicated disease had become the victim of another that refused to die. His death was more than symbolic. It was a reminder that victory is never absolute. Meanwhile, deep in the corridors of power, world leaders continued to debate the same haunting question: destroy the last smallpox samples or preserve them. Scientists argued on both sides. Destroying them would eliminate the risk of accidental release, but it would also erase the ability to study the virus if ever it reemerged, naturally or artificially. Others feared that secret stockpiles might already exist, in nations unwilling to admit it, meaning destroying the official ones would leave the world defenseless. And so, year after year, vote after vote, the decision was delayed. The vials remained. The locks stayed in place. The virus slept on a relic of terror preserved by the same hands that once swore to destroy it. Imagine a silent room, lit only by the blue glow of refrigeration units. Shelves lined with glass tubes, each holding a legacy of death frozen in time. A hum fills the air, the sound of containment. But containment is never peace. One malfunction, one power failure, one act of negligence, and history could breathe again. In that quiet, mechanical chamber lies humanity's greatest paradox. We hold the key to our own extinction, and we choose to keep it. The world that celebrated October 26th as the end of smallpox now faces new enemies, invisible, unpredictable, and fast. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us how fragile our systems truly are. It raised a chilling thought among scientists. If a new pathogen could bring the modern world to its knees, what chance would we have if smallpox, with its 30% fatality rate, ever escaped again? Some researchers argue that the next outbreak won't come from nature, but from the mistakes of humans who tried to control it. The line between progress and peril grows thinner every year. And yet, there's something deeply human about keeping that vial alive. Perhaps it's not arrogance, but remembrance. A reminder of what we overcame and of what we could lose if we ever forget. Because forgetting is how history repeats itself. In the hum of the freezers, in the archives of the World Health Organization, in the notebooks of scientists who still study the virus's genome, smallpox lives on, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. A reflection of the endless dance between creation and destruction, between knowledge and danger. The day smallpox was eradicated marked the end of one war and the beginning of another, quieter one. A war of vigilance, of responsibility, of remembering that what we lock away in darkness still belongs to us, and we to it. Somewhere, deep inside a lab in Atlanta, a researcher pauses before one of those locked freezers. Behind the glass, the frost shimmers like stars in a frozen sky. They stand there for a moment, realizing the enormity of what lies before them, a ghost that once haunted billions, now reduced to a whisper in a jar. And in that silence, a question rises like breath on cold glass. Is humanity the guardian of that whisper, or its next victim? Outside, the night stretches long and cold, the world asleep under the illusion of safety. But beneath it all, in steel vaults and coded sequences, something ancient still waits, not with hunger, but with patience. The story of smallpox isn't over. It's only resting for now. The hum of the freezers echoed in the dark, sterile chamber, low and constant, like the breath of something ancient that refused to die. The light flickered, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to remind those who worked there that even perfection could fail. For decades, those rooms had been symbols of control, of humanity's triumph over chaos. But control is an illusion. All it takes is one moment of weakness, one slip, one unnoticed anomaly, to unmake everything we believe we've mastered. The turning point began not with an explosion, not with panic, but with silence. In 2022, during a routine systems check at the CDC's high containment facility in Atlanta, a technician noticed something strange. One of the refrigeration units showed a minor temperature fluctuation, just a few degrees. It wasn't catastrophic, not even enough to trigger a full alarm. But for the scientists who understood what lay inside, even a few degrees could mean everything. They isolated the unit, locked down the corridor, and followed every protocol with the precision of soldiers defusing a bomb. Yet, deep beneath their professionalism, a ripple of unease spread. When the investigation concluded, the official report was simple: equipment, malfunction, no breach, no exposure. The samples were intact, but among the team, a question lingered. Had they truly been intact? Or had something unseen, something microscopic, slipped past unnoticed? No one said it aloud. They didn't have to. Every scientist who entered that facility carried the same secret fear. The idea that the ghost they had trapped might find a way to breathe again. Beyond those locked doors, the world went on. People celebrated progress, not knowing that their safety balanced on a thread of ice and steel. But nature had begun writing its own subplot, one that humans could not control. As global temperatures climbed and ancient ice thawed, reports began emerging from the northernmost regions: Siberia, Alaska, parts of Greenland. Strange viral fragments were being detected in samples of permafrost meltwater. Most were harmless relics, too degraded to infect. But not all. In 2025, a research team studying thawed remains near Yakutsk reported something that sent tremors through the scientific community. They had isolated an intact strain of an orthopoxvirus, a cousin of smallpox, long thought extinct. It wasn't variola major, but close enough to make hearts stop. The discovery was accidental. A thawed burial site from the 1800s had exposed preserved human remains, their skin still bearing the distinctive scars of smallpox. Samples were collected, studied under containment, and for the first time in nearly half a century, a virus from the smallpox family replicated inside human cells. It wasn't smallpox, but it was a message, a reminder that extinction is rarely permanent. In the weeks that followed, labs across the world scrambled to confirm the finding. Governments issued cautious statements. The media, hungry for sensation, called it the awakening virus. But beneath the headlines, in closed-door meetings between World Health officials and defense agencies, panic began to grow. Because if an ancient virus could survive in the ice, what else could be sleeping there? The Arctic was melting faster than predicted. Entire regions once locked in frost for millennia were now rivers of mud and bone. The dead were resurfacing, not just human, but animal. Their DNA carrying secrets from forgotten pandemics. The very Earth seemed to be exhaling its buried memories, and humanity was standing too close. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, a scientist named Dr. Eleanor Ruiz couldn't shake a feeling she'd carried since the temperature anomaly months earlier. She was meticulous, rational, and fiercely loyal to the scientific method, but something about that incident felt unfinished. The data logs were too clean, too perfect. No system, she knew, ever erased its own errors so neatly. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the lab after hours. The corridors were empty, the air thick with the metallic temps of sterilization. She accessed the archived maintenance records, scrolling through line after line of code. Then she saw a single entry, time-stamped 3 seconds before the system reset. V042 a containment reference. A sample tag. It wasn't one of theirs. When she traced the code through the internal catalog, it led to a sample supposedly destroyed in 1984, a classified vial of a unique variola strain used for early genetic sequencing tests. Every record showed it had been neutralized decades ago, but if the system had registered it that night, that meant her breath caught. Something existed that shouldn't. The next morning, she brought her findings to her superior, only to be met with a forced smile and a quiet dismissal. It's a clerical echo, he told her. Old systems make ghosts all the time. But his eyes betrayed something else, something wary, something rehearsed. The conversation ended abruptly. That night, her system access was revoked. She understood the message clearly. Stop asking questions. But curiosity is a kind of infection, and once it spreads, it consumes. Over the next weeks, Ruiz quietly gathered what she could of restricted files, archived emails, internal memos. What she found painted a pattern of subtle secrecy stretching back years. Missing vials, reclassified samples, anomalous temperature readings quietly marked resolved. There was no evidence of an outbreak, but there was evidence of fear. The kind of fear that makes institutions hide truths they can't control. And as she dug deeper, a realization began to take hold. Perhaps smallpox had never truly gone. Perhaps it had been waiting, studied, modified, even replicated under projects to classify the name. One document stopped her cold. A research brief from 2019, labeled Project Renaissance, described a theoretical study on reviving extinct pathogens to enhance vaccine resilience against future biological threats. The lead author's name had been redacted, but Ruiz recognized the formatting. It was U.S. government standard. The proposal spoke of controlled reconstitution of variola-like viral vectors. In other words, bringing it back. Ruiz stared at the screen, her pulse thudding in her ears. Every instinct screamed denial. Surely, no one would dare. But the deeper she read, the clearer it became. Humanity's greatest victory might have quietly been undone. Not by accident, but by ambition. The justification was the same one history always used: protection. The best way to defend against a threat, they argued, was to understand it. But the line between understanding and reviving was razor, and somewhere in that blurred line, something irreversible may have already happened. Ruiz's discovery would never reach the public. Within days, her files were seized, her ID revoked, her contract terminated for policy violations. She vanished from the scientific community like a footprint washed away by rain. But whispers of her research leaked enough to draw the attention of a few journalists and one investigative filmmaker, a man named Daniel Reeve. He had built his career documenting the dark intersections of science and ethics. When he heard about Ruiz, he began to follow her trail. His film would never be completed. 2 months into his investigation, Reeve died in what was ruled an accidental fire at his home office. His hard drives were recovered, but encrypted. His final voicemail to a colleague contained only one sentence. They're not preserving it anymore. They're perfecting it. The official explanation was silence. No one confirmed, No one denied. But in private, intelligence agencies began issuing new reports. A rise in biolab incidents globally, unexplained illnesses in isolated research sites, missing viral registries. The dots were never connected publicly, but behind the curtain, patterns began to emerge. The story that began as triumph was curdling into a warning. Meanwhile, in parts of northern Canada, medical teams reported strange lesions appearing in remote populations. Pox-like, but not identical to anything known. The symptoms were mild, treatable, but eerily familiar. Samples were collected, analyzed, and quietly sent to the CDC. Official statements called it a localized viral rash of unknown origin. The public never heard the name. Scientists whispered in private, variola minor hybrid. The world didn't panic because it didn't know. Not yet. And as humanity went about its ordinary days, scrolling through screens, planning futures, celebrating progress, a hidden story was unfolding in sterile corridors and icy graves. The ghost of smallpox was no longer just memory. It was movement. Eleanor Ruiz, now living under another name, watched it unfold from afar. Every headline, every denial, every scientific anomaly, they all confirmed what she already knew. What humanity had locked away had begun to stir. And worse, it wasn't entirely natural anymore. It had been touched, altered, molded by the very hands that once swore to end it. One night, sitting in a dim motel room lit only by the glow of her laptop, she read the latest report. New clusters of unknown poxvirus activity in 2 continents simultaneously. Too similar to be coincidence. Too distant to be local. Her hands trembled as she stared at the data. She whispered the words that no scientist had dared to speak for 48 years. It's back. But even she couldn't know. It wasn't coming back as it was. It was coming back as something new. And as the world slept, unaware, the first cough echoed in a remote field clinic in northern Greenland. A fever followed. Then the spots. Some stories don't end when we think they do. They pause long enough for us to forget what it felt like to be afraid. And when fear returns, it doesn't knock. It breaks the door down. The silence that followed was almost cruel in its weight. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort but suffocates. The world outside seemed to pause, the air hanging heavy with a sense of unspoken dread. A single beam of moonlight slipped through the cracked window, slicing across the room and illuminating the fine layer of dust floating through the air, particles of time suspended between what had been and what was about to come. The documents were still on the table, spread open like open wounds, whispering truths that had been buried too deep to stay forgotten. And as his eyes darted across the final lines, the truth began to rearrange itself in his mind, not as revelation, but as a wound reopening. He stepped back, trembling slightly, every breath shallow. What he had once believed to be coincidence now looked deliberate. Every message, every missing piece, every shadow that had followed him suddenly made sense, not as fate, but as a chain of intentions forged long before he was even aware of the game he was in. His reflection in the window stared back at him, pale, uncertain, with the faintest hint of terror in his eyes. The man looking back wasn't the same one who had started this journey. There was something darker now, something that understood that knowledge and safety could not coexist. Outside, the wind began to stir. Leaves scraped across the pavement, whispering like restless ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. Maybe just the storm. Maybe something else. He felt the pull to run, but the deeper instinct was to stay, to face whatever waited behind the truth he had uncovered. He gathered the papers into a trembling stack, his fingers tracing over the old ink, smudged fingerprints, and initials that now carried new meaning. There was a pattern hidden beneath the chaos, a silent rhythm that connected all the names, all the places. He could almost hear it now like a pulse beneath the surface, leading him somewhere he didn't yet understand. He found himself walking again, out into the night. The rain had started, soft at first, then heavier, drenching the streets in glistening reflections. Each streetlight flickered as if uncertain whether to stay awake or give in to the darkness. The city looked different now. Not alive, but watching. Every sound felt amplified. The distant hum of an engine, the hiss of water against metal, the whisper of a figure moving just beyond sight. He didn't know whether it was paranoia or perception anymore. Both felt the same. When he reached the corner, he hesitated. The building ahead was old, its windows dark, its sign half-erased by years of neglect. He recognized it from the documents of forgotten property tied to the same initials that haunted every page. His hand hovered over the rusted handle, and for a long moment, he simply stood there, listening. Nothing. Then, a faint hum, mechanical, steady. Something was alive inside. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway, choked with shadows. The air was thick with the smell of metal, damp concrete, and something faintly electrical. He moved slowly, his footsteps soft but echoing through the empty space. Wires lined the ceiling like veins, pulsing faintly with blue light that flickered in sync with his heartbeat. Every few steps, he caught the trace of movement. Not enough to see, but enough to feel. He could sense that he wasn't alone. Then, at the end of the corridor, he saw a room lit by a cold, sterile glow. Machines lined the walls, some still humming faintly, others long dead. On a central table sat a terminal, its screen awake, waiting. His reflection appeared in its pale light as he stepped closer, the glow painting his face in shifting shades of blue and gray. The terminal blinked once, and then text began to appear, line by line, typing itself out as if an unseen hand was writing from the other side. "You shouldn't have come back!" The words froze him. He stared at the screen, waiting for more. The next line appeared slowly. "It's not what you think." It never was. He swallowed hard, the sound too loud in the empty room. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He typed, hesitated, then hit enter. "Who are you?" The response came instantly, as though the entity on the other end had been waiting all along. "Someone who tried to warn you!" His pulse quickened. "Warn me about what?" He typed, and for a moment the screen went blank. Then it returned a flood of fragmented text, coordinates, timestamps, and phrases half corrupted, half readable. Among them, one line stood out, glowing faintly, as if to command attention. The experiment never ended. He stepped back, the room spinning slightly. Images flickered through his mind. The missing people, the strange patterns in the data, the coincidences that had never been coincidences. His entire search had been for the truth, but the truth was no longer something distant. It was alive. And it was watching him. A faint click broke the silence. The sound of a security camera rotating in the corner. He looked up. The red light was blinking again. Someone was monitoring the feed. He lunged toward the machine, but before he could pull the cord, the screen flashed to black. A single new message appeared. "You've seen enough." And then everything went dark. He froze, surrounded by the hum of dying machines and the echo of his own breathing. Somewhere above him, something shifted, a metallic groan, the sound of weight moving across the ceiling. His instincts screamed for him to leave, but he couldn't move. The air grew thicker, heavier, until the dim emergency light flickered on, revealing the faint outline of another figure at the far end of the room. The figure didn't move. It just watched. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice cracking. No answer. The figure stepped forward once, just enough for the light to catch its face. For a moment, he thought he recognized it. The same eyes. The same uncertainty. It looked like him. The realization hit hard. Not metaphor, not hallucination, but something deeply real. A mirror image, aged by something he couldn't name. The figure raised its hand slowly, pointing to the wall behind him. He turned. There, written in red across the cracked concrete, were words that hadn't been there before. They needed a replacement. A rush of nausea hit him. The air thinned, the sound around him dimmed, until all that remained was the hollow echo of his heartbeat. When he turned back, the figure was gone. Only the faint ripple of disturbed air remained, as if the world had just exhaled. He stumbled backward, out into the hall, gasping. The storm outside had grown violent, thunder rolling over the rooftops, lightning cutting through the black sky. As he reached the street, the first bolt struck nearby, lighting the entire block for a split second. And in that momentary flash, he saw them figures standing motionless in the rain, scattered across the street, all facing him. The rain washed over his face, stinging his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The figures didn't move, didn't breathe. They just stood, their faces hidden in shadow. The only sound was the rhythmic dripping of rainwater against the pavement, like the ticking of some unseen clock counting down. Then one of the figures stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. He could feel the air change, the kind of electric pressure that comes before disaster. The voice that followed was calm, almost sorrowful. "You weren't supposed to find it," the figure said. "Now it will start again." Lightning struck once more, blindingly close, and when his vision cleared, they were gone. The street was empty again, silent except for the rain. He stood there for a long moment, trembling, drenched, the realization cutting deeper than the cold. Whatever had been hidden was now awake. Far away, back in that abandoned building, the terminal screen flickered back to life for just a moment. A final message appeared, glowing faintly in the darkness. Initiation complete. And just like that, the world, or whatever remained of it, seemed to shudder as though it had just remembered something it was meant to forget. The world didn't end with thunder. It ended in silence. A silence so complete, it devoured even the sound of his own breath. The rain that had lashed against the streets a moment ago was gone, replaced by a dense stillness that hung like fog. Every shadow seemed to still, every corner too deliberate, as though the city itself had been frozen. He stood there, drenched and trembling, his mind still echoing with the last words he had seen. Initiation complete. At first, he thought the stillness was in his head. Then he saw the car that had stopped in the middle of the road. Headlights cutting through the mist, engine idling, but the driver wasn't moving. The figure behind the wheel sat motionless, eyes open, unblinking. Across the street, a woman with an umbrella stood frozen midst. The raindrops that had clung to her umbrella hung suspended in the air, glinting like glass beads caught in invisible strings. He reached out, his hand shaking, and touched one of the floating drops. It didn't fall. It clung to his fingertip, unnaturally still. His chest tightened. Whatever had begun inside that building hadn't ended with him leaving. It had followed him out. It had rewritten something fundamental. A low vibration trembled through the ground, faint at first, then rising, resonating in his bones. The streetlights began to flicker, pulsing in sync with the rhythm. Thrum, 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 thrum like a heartbeat, mechanical and ancient. He turned in slow disbelief as every screen in the nearby shops and apartments flickered to life, each displaying the same sequence, a line of text repeating endlessly, written in the same pale blue he had seen on the terminal. Phase 2. Observation. The words burned into his mind. Around him, the world began to stir, not naturally, but in fragments. The people who had been frozen started moving again, but not as themselves. Their movements were slow, stilted, as though something else had taken over the rhythm of their bodies. Eyes vacant, steps synchronized. They began to turn toward him, not with emotion, but with purpose. He stumbled backward, his shoes splashing through water that didn't ripple. Panic burned through his chest, his instincts screaming at him to run. But another part of him, the part that had chased every lead, every fragment of truth, whispered that there was nowhere left to run. This wasn't about escape anymore. This was about understanding. He forced himself to stop, to breathe. To see? The faces surrounding him, blank, drained of individuality, weren't strangers. Some, he recognized. Faces from photographs in the old documents. Missing people. The ones he'd been tracing for months, years even. They were all here, alive and not alive, caught somewhere between existence and surrender. And as they closed in, their eyes began to glow faintly, the same cold hue as the text on the screens. A realization struck him like a blade. They weren't victims. They were carriers. The experiment, whatever it truly was, had never been about testing something external. It had been about replication, about continuity. He ran, his legs moved before his mind could stop him. splashing through the spectral rain, down alleys that twisted like veins. The lights above him shifted, following his path, guiding him somewhere he didn't want to go, but couldn't resist. He reached the outskirts of the city, the old industrial district where the air smelled like rust and memory. There, half buried beneath decades of neglect, was another building. No lights, no hum. Just a heavy iron door, with the same symbol he had seen before, a perfect circle split by a single vertical line. The mark of the experiment, the mark of those who had built it. He hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The door groaned like a wounded creature, and the air that met him was cold enough to sting his lungs. Inside, the space stretched wider than it should have, rows upon rows of dormant machines, their outlines lost in darkness. The faint buzz of electricity hummed from somewhere deep below. As he moved forward, the darkness seemed to react, flickering lights bursting to life one by one, illuminating fragments of what lay ahead. Metal tables, restraints, monitors displaying neural patterns, looping endlessly. And in the center, a glass chamber filled with a swirling mist. Something moved within it, faintly outlined by pulses of dim light. He stepped closer, heart pounding. The mist parted for just a moment. He saw a face. His face! He staggered back, the weight of it crushing his chest. The reflection, or whatever it was, wasn't a mirror image this time. It was him. But different? Younger? Colder? The same scar along the jawline. But the eyes were alive in a way his no longer were. A faint voice began to echo from unseen speakers, layered, mechanical, yet eerily human. "You were never meant to find the original sequence," it said. "But you did, which means you were ready." "Ready for what?" he whispered. The chamber flickered with light, the figure inside turning its head toward him. The voice deepened. "To continue the pattern! To preserve the consciousness! You were part of it all along!" His pulse hammered in his throat. Memories, or fragments of them, began surfacing in flashes. The hospital bed, the wires, the sensation of drowning not in water, but in light. The sleepless nights filled with static dreams that never belonged to him. The sense that his thoughts had always been observed, adjusted. It wasn't paranoia. It was programming! "You're lying," he said, though the words lacked conviction. "Ari! We?" The voice sharpened, gaining something almost emotional. "You think you've been searching for the truth? But you've only been searching for yourself!" He pressed his palms to his temples, the pain sharp and electric. The screens around him began to light up again, showing images from his life, walking the streets, reading the files, speaking to people who no longer existed. But in every scene, there was a delay, a flicker, as though reality itself had been stitched together imperfectly. "Everything you remember," the voice continued, "was an iteration. Each version learns, adjusts, evolves. You are the 13th. The words hit harder than any physical blow. 13th. A copy. Not the first. Not the original. Just one in a sequence designed to search for answers that no one was meant to find." His throat tightened, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Why me?" The lights dimmed, and for a moment, the only illumination came from within the chamber. The figure inside reached out, pressing its hand against the glass. "Because you keep asking that question," it said softly. "And because the moment you stop, the pattern collapses." The glass began to crack, slowly at first, then faster, spider webbing under invisible pressure. He backed away, but the chamber burst open with a rush of cold vapor, flooding the room in blinding white. He shielded his face, coughing, his lungs burning. When the mist cleared, the chamber was empty. But he wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, measured, deliberate. He turned. The figure was standing there now, no longer behind glass, dressed in the same worn coat, the same expression of dawning horror. They were identical in every way, except for one detail. The other version's eyes were completely white, glowing faintly from within. It spoke his own voice, perfectly mirrored. It's time! The lights flickered violently, the air vibrating with energy. Machines roared to life, the ground trembling as if the entire structure was awakening. He stumbled backward, his mind fracturing under the impossible sight. The other him stepped closer, hand outstretched. "You were never meant to destroy it," it said. "You were meant to become it." He wanted to run, to scream, to deny everything. But the world around him was already unraveling, the walls bending, colors distorting, gravity shifting. He felt himself being pulled forward, drawn toward the figure as light consumed the edges of his vision. For a moment, their fingertips touched. And in that instant, everything that had been hidden ignited in his mind. He saw the faces of every iteration, the 12 before him, each one waking, discovering, falling, starting again. 1,000 lifetimes repeating in endless succession, all converging into this single moment of realization. He wasn't the victim of an experiment. He was the experiment. The system didn't just monitor consciousness, it recycled it, refining it each time. The light grew unbearable. He screamed, though no sound came out. The world dissolved into fragments of memory, rain, glass, voices, data, faces, everything collapsing into a single, blinding pulse. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence. When his eyes opened again, he was back in the room where it all began. The terminal hummed softly. The screen was blank, except for a single blinking cursor. His hands trembled as he reached toward it, unsure whether this was another layer, another iteration, or the end. Then, words began to appear slowly across the screen. Sequence 14 initialized. His reflection flickered in the glass, tired, hollow, but faintly smiling. The cycle had already started again. And yet, somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of memory and code, something human still whispered, "Remember?" The lights dimmed, the hum deepened, and the world exhaled once more, ready to begin again. The hum of the machine faded into silence, leaving only the faint echo of electricity dissolving in the air. He sat there, eyes fixed on the screen, watching the blinking cursor pulse like a heartbeat, steady, patient, eternal. The word sequence 14 initialized stared back at him, glowing softly in the dark. For a long moment, he didn't move. The world around him felt weightless, as if time had decided to hold its breath, waiting for him to choose whether to exist or to vanish. The storm was gone. In its place, only stillness remained, the kind that comes not from peace, but from the exhaustion of everything that came before. He rose slowly, his movements uncertain, as though he were testing gravity for the first time. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and old dust, remnants of something that had ended and begun all at once. His reflection in the dark glass of the monitor was faint, but there was something different now. A quiet understanding, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. He touched the edge of the desk, grounding himself. The surface felt familiar, worn by countless hands that had come before his. Maybe they were all his. Maybe this place had always been waiting for him to return. He walked toward the doorway, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hall. The light above flickered in slow, rhythmic waves, like a dying heartbeat syncing with his own. Outside, dawn was breaking. The first light of morning poured through the cracked windows, spilling gold across the concrete floor. Dust rose and danced in it, like particles of memory, floating without weight or meaning until light gave them form. He stepped into it, feeling the warmth spread across his face. It was the first real sunlight he'd felt in what seemed like lifetimes. For the first time, the world looked new, not in the way of discovery, but in the way of remembrance. The buildings, the air, the earth beneath his feet, they all seemed to hum with something ancient and alive. It was as though everything had been waiting for this moment of recognition, this merging of understanding and surrender. The pattern had completed another circle, but this time something had changed within it. He could feel the weight of all the iterations before him, every version that had tried and failed to break free, every self that had dissolved into data and memory. But their presence didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like companionship. As if, for the first time, He wasn't carrying their failures, he was carrying their hope. He walked through the empty streets, the city waking slowly around him. Cars that had once been frozen hummed to life. Neon signs flickered back into color. People began to move again, their faces returning to the subtle chaos of human life. Worry, laughter, exhaustion, desire. The mechanical stillness that had haunted the world was gone. In its place was imperfection, unpredictable, and fragile. And somehow, that felt right. He stopped at a small puddle reflecting the rising sun. For a moment, he saw the face of the other him, the one behind the glass, the one whose eyes had been all light and no soul. But when he blinked, the reflection changed. It was only him now. The same face, the same scar, the same eyes, but filled with something new. A quiet flame. A will! The realization came not as a jolt, but as a whisper. The system hadn't failed. It had fulfilled its purpose. Not to erase humanity, but to understand it, to reach a version of consciousness that could finally remember what it meant to feel. Each sequence, each repetition had been trying to rediscover the one element that couldn't be coded. Empathy. The moment he looked at his reflection and saw not data, but a soul, that was the moment the cycle began to break. He stood there in the light, listening to the faint sounds of morning, a distant dog barking, the hum of electricity, a train horn cutting through the air. Simple sounds, real sounds. Each one anchored him more firmly in this moment, reminding him that reality, no matter how fragile, was still worth holding on to. The screen had called it Sequence 14, but maybe that wasn't another iteration. Maybe it was the first true beginning. Not a reset, but an awakening. The system had learned what it needed to know, and so had he. The experiment wasn't about control. It was about the capacity to choose to see beyond the loops of fear and the circuitry of memory, to choose compassion over calculation. As he walked further, he noticed a group of children chasing a paper airplane across the street. Their laughter echoed between the buildings, careless and unrestrained. He paused, watching them, the sound cutting through the remnants of static still lingering in his head. In that laughter, he heard everything the machine could never replicate: spontaneity, imperfection, joy. The pattern couldn't contain it. It could only observe. A faint smile touched his lips. Maybe that was the lesson hidden in the code all along? That perfection was never the goal. It was the flaw, the unpredictable crack in the glass that made consciousness beautiful. Maybe that was why the system kept restarting. Not because it failed, but because it couldn't capture what was never meant to be captured. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were parting, revealing streaks of pale blue stretching into infinity. For the first time, he didn't feel small beneath it. He felt connected. Part of a pattern, vast and alive, one that didn't need to be controlled, only understood. His thoughts drifted to the versions of himself that had come before. The ones who had searched and suffered and broken against the same walls. He imagined them walking beside him now, not as ghosts, but as echoes of curiosity that had led him here. Each one had asked the same question, even when they didn't have the words for it. Who am I? Really? The answer, he realized, wasn't in the data, or the experiment, or the endless cycles. It was here, in the quiet intersection between awareness and choice. He wasn't a sequence. He wasn't a subject. He was a witness to the world, to himself, to the miracle of consciousness continuing despite everything. The streetlights flickered one last time before fading with the dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. The air was cool and alive. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him. The fear that had once driven him now felt like an old memory, distant, soft by time. What replaced it wasn't certainty, but peace. And in that peace, a final thought rose within him. Simple, yet infinite. If the pattern was made to understand humanity, then maybe humanity was made to remind the pattern what it means to be alive. He opened his eyes again. The city stretched before him. Ordinary yet luminous. Every detail glowing with quiet significance. A bird landing on a wire, steam rising from a vent, the faint glimmer of sunlight on glass. For the first time, he didn't wonder whether any of it was real. The question no longer mattered. What mattered was that he could feel it. He took a breath, deep and steady, and stepped forward. The world responded, a breeze passing through the streets, carrying with it the sound of life returning. Somewhere behind him, the building that had once held the machine began to crumble in silence, like an old skin being shed. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to return to, only the vast unknown ahead and the quiet awareness that, for the first time in all the sequences, he was truly free to walk into it. The cursor on the abandoned screen blinked once more, as if watching him leave. Then it stilled. The room darkened, the hum faded, and for the first time in its endless history, the system slept. Outside, the sun broke fully over the horizon, scattering light across the earth. And somewhere, in that vast tapestry of beginnings and endings, a single thought lingered, delicate, eternal. Unmeasured by code or sequence, maybe the purpose of creation was never to perfect itself, but to learn how to love its own imperfections. The light brightened, the city exhaled, and the story, for now, became silence.